Together in this beautiful evening here in Vancouver, here in the West Coast. Welcome to all of you who join us in person, who are here with us tonight. And welcome to all of you who join us online from anywhere around the world you may be. My name is Pablo. I am a student here at Regent. As we start, we would like to acknowledge that Regent College sits on the traditional and ceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam First Nation people. Tonight, we are in for a great lecture, one that has been anticipated for quite a long time by many of us. If you are already subscribed to email updates, you will know how important and relevant it is to be aware of what is happening here at Regent, to be always in the know as what's happening and what's coming up. If you are not registered yet, sign up online. We would like to invite you to grab one of these little blue cards that are by the donations box at the entrance. When you do that, you have two options. On the blue side, you can follow the link and register yourself digitally. If not, on the white part of the card, there is a space for you to enter your name and your email address, and we will register you from our side. Either way, this is the best way to be always in the know as of what's happening here at Regent. Events, resources, activities that are happening all the time. Before we start, if you have any electronic device that may produce any sound, if it rings, if it dings, or if it buzzes, right now is the time to put it on silent mode, as we would not like to have any disruptions to our lecture tonight. Apparently, it's quite embarrassing to be the one whose phone is ringing in the middle of the lecture. We would not like it to be you. So if you have any electronic device, right now is the time to put it on silent mode. And lastly, those of you who join us in person, please be aware that we are live streaming and recording this lecture under the conditions spelled out in the public lecture posted by the doors of Regent and the doors of Regent of Chapel here. At this point, I would like to introduce Professor Dr. Cindy Alders. She is Associate Professor of History of Christianity here at Regent, and she is also our Library Director. Cindy, over to you.
Thanks, Pablo. Let me add my welcome to all of you today, those of you who are here in person in the chapel, and those of you who are joining us via the live stream. Welcome. We're really glad that you're here today. Let me explain our format before I introduce our speaker. Our lecturer, Sarah Williams, will lecture for about 50 minutes, something like that, yeah. And following Sarah's talk, we're gonna have time for some Q&A. So if you're in the room, you can ask questions at one of the two mics that are there in the back. So be thinking of your questions as we go along. If you are joining us via the live stream, you can email your questions to questions@regent-college.edu. And our evening will wrap up by about 9 p.m. tonight. It is also my great honor to introduce Sarah Williams back to Regent. Sarah is a historian, writer, and storyteller. She trained as a historian at the University of Oxford, where she subsequently taught as Fellow and Tutor in Modern History at Manchester College, lecturer at Trinity College, and Praelector at Lincoln College. At Oxford, she taught British and European political and cultural history from 1695 to 1939, and supervised graduate students working on 19th and early 20th century religion and culture in the British context. In 2005, Sarah moved with her family to Vancouver to teach the history of Christianity here at Regent, where she was a beloved professor to many, including myself. She was once my teacher. After teaching at Regent for over a decade, Sarah returned to the UK with Paul, her husband, and now they live in the Cotswolds, close to the city of Oxford, where she continues to write and research. And Sarah remains a research professor here at Regent and returns regularly to teach during Regent's summer programs, which makes us all really happy. Next week, Sarah is teaching Marriage, Sex, and Gender in Historical Perspective. That's July 7th to 11th. You can still register if you'd like to, as part of Regent's 2025 summer programs. And finally, enough from me, the title of Sarah's lecture tonight is When Courage Calls, Josephine Butler and the Radical Pursuit of Justice for Women. Please welcome Sarah.
And thank you, Pablo. And thank you, everybody, for coming here this evening. There's some very familiar faces in this audience, so I feel at home already. Come with me. June the 19th, 1911, 5 years after the death of Josephine Butler, 4,000 women marching across Westminster Bridge to the Houses of Parliament, calling on the government to extend the vote to women. The parade stretched 7 miles. Banners, costumes, music, art, dancing, the largest suffrage march ever to be held in Britain. But what caught the attention of the newspaper correspondents reporting on this spectacle was actually the Christian imagery employed in the spectacle of it all. The vast number of processional crosses, hundreds of banners covered in verses of scripture, an entire contingent of clergymen looking really out of place in a sea of women. Purple robes everywhere. And right at the front, you see in the image, Joan of Arc on a horse. And behind Joan of Arc, and I wish I had a picture of this, banners carried with embroidered images of Josephine Butler. For at least a decade, right through the interwar period, Butler's legacy was central to the women's movement. Her contemporaries were in absolutely no doubt. The suffrage campaign was a holy war, and Butler epitomized this holy war. Good old Millicent Fawcett, here she is in bronze outside the Houses of Parliament. Has anybody been to that statue? You've seen her? Oh, well, next time you're in London, she's iconic. But she called Josephine Butler the most distinguished woman of the 19th century. So it's curious that most of us have actually never heard of her. And I've been to many places over the last year, and I've been surprised how few people have heard of Butler, given how significant she was. Writing at the end of the 20th century, feminist scholars of the so-called second wave found Butler deeply problematic. She didn't fit their categories. She unsettled the trajectory of change that these scholars wanted to trace through time to explain the history of the women's movement. And in their really influential version of the story which still finds its way onto the pages of most high school history books, Josephine Butler was a kind of antagonist. The Christian faith that Butler claimed was the very center of her life was the thing that these post-war Western feminists believed women must be liberated from in order for feminism and its goal to be realized. These second-wave feminist scholars writing in the 1970s and the 1980s, for them, the sexual revolution from the 60s onwards was actually a religious revolution. And during this revolution, women finally escaped the shackles of Christianity and they ushered in an emancipated age of secularity. Josephine Butler didn't fit the categories. She defied the assumptions of those who wrote the history books by bringing together the very things that they thought were antithetical. She was too Christian for the feminist camp, but she was also far too feminist for the Christian camp. She fell between the pages of history, because for scholars working in the late 20th century on religious history, also recoiling from the effects of the sexual revolution, Butler's outspoken critique of the male hierarchy and the institutional church was rather unsettling. And from the perspective of these religious historians, most of them writing from an explicitly faith perspective, and all of them male, Butler was right on the edge. She was part of a potentially dangerous revolt that seemed to be threatening the stability of society and the historic role of Christianity in the culture. So Butler was simply left out of the Christian history books as well. She fell between the camps, didn't fit the categories, and really that's why most people haven't heard of her. Now, there's been a lot of revisionist work done in the early 20th century. I need some water here. But the thing is about academic history, not very many people read history books these days. And we can revise as much as we like in the academy, but it doesn't necessarily change the mainstream story. And storytelling has been much maligned in the academy, especially among historians. In fact, in many ways, historians use the phrase storytelling as a counterpart or a counterpoint to evidence-based critical analysis. It's a sort of dirty word. But we need stories, don't we, as human beings? We need stories. We need stories that move us, that challenge us, that shake us out of our comfort zone. And within the Christian tradition as a whole, the lives of the saints have always offered this rich treasure store that stories the imagination of the people of God through time. They've been an inspiration. They're a goad, aren't they, to deeper levels of godly pursuit. But in our fearful post-Reformation Protestant state, we don't quite know what to do with the lives of the saints. We're ambivalent about them. Sometimes we're even dismissive of their stories as mere hagiography. But we still say the creed, don't we? I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints. I believe in the communion of saints. Actually, that line of the creed gets me every time in the guts. It's the line of the creed that moves me more than any other. I'm instantly in Romans 11. And I can hear the cheers from the stands, from the stadium. And as I see it in my mind's eye, in that crowd, I can see some of the people I love the best, like Bernard of Clairvaux, and Teresa of Avila, and dear St. Francis. I can hear them cheering. Our imperfect faith made complete by the author and perfecter of our faith. Our faith made complete with their faith. Remember that in Ephesians 1:13? It describes us, all of us, through time as God's glorious inheritance. So I spent much of my life longing to tell the stories of the saints, pure and simple. In fact, Don Lewis and Bruce Hindmarsh took me to the Irish pub on 10th, and they pleaded with me to write stories of the saints. And I didn't quite get round to it while I was here at Regent. But finally, I got to do what I love. I wrote the story of Josephine Butler. And it was a profound homecoming for me, but also a challenge. I tried to combine my academic learning with storytelling. It was a really obvious thing for me to choose a modern female Protestant saint, one whose life happens to span the Victorian period that I've spent my life studying. And all I want to do this evening, see, I'm not still even in the right time zone. I just want to tell you a bit of her story. because I want you to read about her in the book that I've written. But actually, far more than that, I believe that her life actually holds something that is deeply relevant for us today. An inspiration, but also a very urgent challenge. So let's begin, like all good stories, in medias res. Oxford, 1852. A young woman of faith from a family of faith. Her father was close friends with Clarkson and Wilberforce, involved in that abolitionist campaign. 24-year-old from Northumbria, genteel, refined, from the Grey family of Earl Grey tea, and Whig Prime Minister at the time of the Abolition of Slavery Act of 1833, privileged, educated, and by all accounts, strikingly beautiful. And she came to Oxford. She actually lived on the High, at 142, on the High Street, just after she got married to George Butler, who was a classics lecturer at Exeter College. And when they first arrived in Oxford, she wasn't remotely intimidated by the learned men of Oxford. And they were men, because women couldn't read for degrees at Oxford until the 1920s. And slowly, as you read her recollections, her wonder at Oxford, this idyll of learning, gives way to profound disillusionment. She starts to see behind the surface. And a book appears on the bookshelves of Blackwell's in 1853. This is actually from one of the versions of this story. The novel by Elizabeth Gaskell, the novel Ruth, it tells the story of a wealthy gentleman who seduces a young woman, Ruth. She's left abandoned, pregnant, thrown from her workplace without a reference, shunned by her family and by society. Very familiar story in Victorian literature. But Gaskell gives it a twist. Ruth is a woman of profound dignity, actually saintliness. And she inhabits the role of the outcast with this dignity that casts into very sharp relief the wrong that's been done to her by her lover. Josephine's absolutely riveted by this story, and she writes about it in her recollection. And she attends an Oxford dinner party, which was a common occurrence in her life with George. And there the learned men of the city shred the book. They rip the argument to pieces. And she sits in stunned silence listening to them, displaying the very same prejudices that she's read about in the story of Ruth. She sees them coming to life. And at the same time, as she's reading this book, Josephine makes friends with a woman called Felicia Skene, a Tractarian based in St. Thomas's Parish in Oxford. And Skene takes Josephine. I always put things in the present tense when I tell stories. It's in the past tense in my notes, but I'm compulsive about the present tense because the story happens concurrently in my mind. History is not in the past, you understand? So forgive me if I get a bit muddled up with my tenses. But Skene takes Josephine to the other side of town. And this is the first time in Josephine's life that she comes into contact with the underworld of Victorian prostitution. She meets young women, some of them very young, brought to the city in order to feed the sexual appetites of the male establishment. And the plight of one woman in particular grabs Butler's attention. This young woman is barely 18. She's left alone to face a pregnancy. And in her distress, the girl kills the baby at birth. And this scandalous case of infanticide all over the press. You can imagine the Victorian press relishing this story, this young woman, as the embodiment of sin. And she's thrown into prison with hard labor. But what Butler also saw was what she calls the crime which is never spoken of. The father sitting at the dinner table, pontificating about the novel, who then goes on his regular visit to the other side of town. The public face and the private life. The man protected by the safe wall of male privilege, and the woman who, once compromised sexually, has nowhere to go, no way to get back into respectable society. And Butler, appalled by the hypocrisy, goes to speak to the eminent theologian and master of Balliol College, Benjamin Jowett. Now, I think it's important to have the picture of Jowett's face, because politics is always personal, isn't it? If it's not, then what does it actually mean? And the notion of going to see somebody face to face in order to challenge a problem of the system, that's very threatening. But Butler goes to see this man, and he is a key figure at the university at that time. And as it happened, he was George Butler's academic patron. He was the man that George needed a reference from in order to be successful in applying for the permanent academic positions that he was seeking. Josephine went to ask Jowett to do something to bring the father to account. Jowett's response: "It's dangerous to rouse a sleeping lion." His recommendation: stay silent. When the girl was released from prison, the Butlers brought her to live in their own home, right there in the middle of Oxford. It was a public participation in this woman's suffering. And suddenly, of course, the Butlers' names no longer appear on the dinner party lists, and they find themselves on the outside of that high wall of prejudice, as Josephine calls it. Oxford was Butler's first encounter with the sexual double standard. One standard of morality for men and another standard of morality for women. She uses two metaphors in her writing over and over again to describe this sexual double standard. First of all, a subterranean fault line that runs right through the foundations of Victorian society. Invisible, but ever present. The second metaphor is a stinking sewer. Again, underneath the house, the beautiful house, the edifice, also invidious, invisible, difficult to name, difficult to address, but it stinks. And these two images, they keep playing in her writing. And this encounter with the sexual double standard shapes Josephine Butler's life, but not straight away. From Oxford, the family moved on when George was unsuccessful in all the jobs that he applied to. They moved on to Cheltenham. That's just up the road from where Paul and I live. George worked. That could, in fact, have been a Freudian slip. Because anybody who's read, some of you have actually already read the story, it's quite difficult not to fall in love with George Butler, isn't it? Yeah. There you go. Sorry, Paul. I muddle you up in my mind. So Cheltenham, down the road from us, George worked as a schoolmaster at Cheltenham College, and their family grew. 3 boys and a girl, this settled stage in their life, much more financially secure, and they're living in this intellectually conducive environment, lots of good friends. But then, in August 1864, just after they'd returned from their summer holiday in Northumbria, George and Josephine went out for tea, and on their return, the children rushed from the nursery on the top floor of the house to say goodnight to their parents. And in the flurry, Eva, the youngest, their only girl, fell over the banisters, 40 feet onto the tiled floor below. It took her 6 hours to die in agony. "Never can I lose that memory," Josephine wrote. Years after the event, she could barely speak of it for over 20 years. The fall, the sudden cry, and then the silence. She was our only daughter, the light and joy of our lives. This is her at that age. And this is a marble bust that they had made of Eva. And for the next 2 years after that terrible accident in 1864, Butler wrestled with deep grief. At times, she could barely leave the house. And when you read the material from this season of her life, it's like entering into a baptism of grief. This deep, dark anguish, but also incredibly beautiful place. Beautiful because during this time, she discovered prayer in a new way. And we know from the entries into her private thoughts journal that she navigated the grief of Eva's death in prayer. When the pain was too deep, she and George wrote out their prayers and left them on tiny fragments of paper on the open pages of the Psalms. And in the months that followed Eva's death, Josephine spent many hours in private prayer, and her experience of intimacy with God intensified. Today, I stood before the Lord. He granted me an audience. He had in his hand the petitions which I desired of him. To pray, this is my life. This is my true, my only life. What is life to me without it? And hidden in these really difficult years, and we see it in that private thoughts journal, sensitized by suffering, she finds this fresh ability to pray for others. She describes a spirit of vicarious suffering and the grace of perpetual intercession. When so weak, she wrote, I often feel as if my heart were breaking, not with misery, but with its heavy burden of desire and love and sorrow. Then I just have to put my hand in Christ's and ask him to put his hand on my heart and keep it quiet. In 1865, she wrote, I long to have 100 voices with all of them, that I might pray without ceasing, that Christ will come quickly and deliver forever the poor groaning world, the slaves from their woes, the victims also, and the slaves of lust in our own land, the poor women who are driven as sheep to the slaughter into the slave markets of London. We are all involved in the guilt of society and in the destruction of the innocents, in the denial of happiness to the young, of purity to children. Such interesting language, such rich language. And we begin to see in this period her vocation emerging. And it's emerging out of intercession. There's this intrinsic link in everything Butler writes between anguish, expressed as this desperate cry of need expressed to God, and the capacity to name, to perceive injustice in society. Anguish, perception, that she links them. The family move from Cheltenham to Liverpool. They move away from the scene of the tragic accident, but still the grief persists. George took up the headmastership of Liverpool College, and when they left for school in the morning, the three boys and George, Josephine was left alone. She writes, I suffered much during the first months in our new home. I only knew that when my heart ached day and night, the only solace would seem to be to find other hearts that ached night and day, and with more reason than mine. This is when she started to visit the Occam sheds. Now, these Occam sheds were underneath the Brownlow workhouse. 4,000 inmates in this workhouse. It was a sort of flagship of workhouses in the British Isles, the poorest of the poor in this rapidly industrializing former slave trading city. And there in the Occam sheds, underneath, in the cellar, women found shelter for a night in exchange for separating the fibres in old rope to use as caulking in the ships, the great ships that went out from the port of Liverpool. Most of the women seeking that shelter, they were engaged in penny prostitution, the most dangerous form of prostitution of all. Most of them were barely more than girls, and their life expectancy, once they were on the streets, was 24, 28, if they were really lucky. I had no clear idea beyond that, Butler writes, going to visit women in the place known for suffering. No plan for helping others. My sole wish was to plunge into the heart of some, I hope that's not my phone, because that's quite possible that it might be. It isn't. It's okay. no plan for helping others. My sole wish was to plunge into the heart of some human misery and to say, as I then knew I could, to afflicted people, I understand I too have suffered. That's a very powerful statement. I understand I too have suffered. She's a middle-class woman. She's had no direct experience of abject poverty or of sexual violence, but she knew what it is to suffer. And it's true, isn't it? Common suffering has this ability, if we will allow it to soften us, to create the possibility of human solidarity, to cross lines of class, privilege, deprivation, race, gender, even religion. I went down to the oakum sheds, Butler writes, and begged admission. I was taken into an immense gloomy vault filled with women and girls, more than 200 probably at that time. I sat on the floor among them and picked oakum. They laughed at me and told me my hands were of no use for that work, which was true. But while they laughed, we became friends. Lots of contrasts in Butler's writings. Lots of contrasts. Middle-class woman, soft hands on the floor with friends. She's begging admission into a workhouse. Nobody wants to go to a workhouse. You don't go there of your own volition. Let me keep reading for a minute because the language is so rich, and hear the language of the incarnation that she weaves into these scenes that are tightly drawn, emotionally charged. I propose that they should learn a few verses to say to me on my next visit. I recall a tall, dark, handsome girl standing up in our midst among the damp refuse and lumps of charred rope and repeating without mistake the words of Jesus, ending with, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give unto you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." And they listened in perfect silence. This audience, wretched, bedraggled, ignorant, criminal some, and wild and defiant others. I said, let's kneel down and cry to that same Jesus who spoke these words. And down on their knees they fell, every one of them, reverently on that damp stone floor, some saying the words after me, others moaning and weeping. It was a strange sound, that united wail, continuous, pitiful, strong, like a great sigh or murmur of vague desire and hope, issuing from the heart of despair, piercing the gloom and murky atmosphere of that vaulted room and reaching to the very heart of God. Butler carried on visiting these women for 2 years. And when some of them became too ill to work, she invited them to live with her family in their home. And one of those stories has moved me deeply. Those of you who've read the book, you'll know the story of Mary Lomax, domestic servant from Matlock. Age of 15, she went into service. The master of the house asked Mary to fetch a cigar case from upstairs. He followed her up, locked the door, and raped her. When Mary became pregnant, she was thrown from her place of employment without a reference. Again, a familiar story. Her parents refused to take her home, and Mary found herself on the streets in Liverpool, nowhere else to go. She was discovered by a brothel keeper, a Mrs. Mandeville, who took her in exchange for the sale of sex. And within 4 years, her child dead, Mary thrown out of the brothel because her consumptive cough was disturbing other clients. So sick, Mary's back on the streets of Liverpool, and she crawls all the way to the Brownlow workhouse, where she tried to kill herself with rat poison. And after this suicide attempt failed, she was placed in a bed in the corner of one of the vast dormitories on the upper floors of the workhouse. And arriving on one of her regular trips, Butler happened to pass Mary's bed. And she stepped over and moved a lock of hair back from Mary's forehead. Such a simple act. But Mary later described that moment when she felt Butler's hand on her forehead as the most important moment in her life. The account that Butler gives of this moment pivots on the description of Mary's eyes. Eyes full of intelligence and penetration. A countenance at once thoughtful and frank, with at times a wildly seeking look, as if our whole being cried out, "Who will show us any good?" This cry, who will show us any good? It runs like a refrain through work after work after work, through many of Butler's published writings. Mary's cry, this anguished cry, it's the cry of those in need, calling out in their distress and their pain, asking to be shown what goodness looks like. And Butler believed that the only way that people can know what goodness looks like is when they have encountered goodness directly from the only one who is good, in prayer. Prayer is, for Butler, to behold him, to behold goodness, to behold perfect justice. And in his presence, the person who prays becomes aware of the difference between justice and injustice. How do we know what that is without encountering justice himself, she asks. And then knowing this goodness allows the goodness to be revealed in us as we begin to act with justice in the world, having seen it in Christ. And kneeling down beside Mary, Butler said really simply, I had a daughter once. Come home with me and let me take care of you. And for 3 months, Mary lived with the Butlers, who nursed her until she died of consumption. And one evening, soon after Mary arrived, George went to pray with her, resolved to raise the question of salvation. He began to tell Mary about Jesus, and I'm pretty much reading from Butler's account here. But she interrupted him. You don't need to tell me about Jesus because I have seen him. Anxious, George asked her, how so? Mary replied, Sir, you've brought me into your home. You've treated me as if I were your own daughter, as if I have done nothing wrong. This is what I mean. I have seen Jesus. This language of seeing, it's everywhere in Butler's writing. Blindness, seeing, the aesthetics of prayer, the beauty of beholding Christ, transforming the perception and allowing the possibility of Christ to be beheld by all those around. And this period in Butler's life of friendship with women on the margins is the start of something new, actually a new course, a new sense of vocation. Bringing Mary into their home opened what Butler described as an avalanche of women. She's such a great writer, vivid. This avalanche of women, you can imagine it. And at all times of the day and night, the Butlers were called upon to go and pray with women on the streets, women who were dying, women who had been church attenders, women who were not. And they quickly saw that the needs of the women that they encountered were far greater than anything they could do in their own homes. So they took a step which felt like a really big step at the time. Compared with the steps that were taken later, was a very small step. They got together with Christians across the city of Liverpool to pray for the women who were falling through the cracks of the city. And at the same time as they prayed, they set up the first house of rest. That's what they called it, a house of rest, a refuge place for women. And actually, this is an image of it. I want to put this image here. I find it very moving because it's now derelict, but it's actually been pulled down in the last few years. But this is the original house. And in here, they established a small envelope factory where the women were given the dignity of work, giving them the possibility of training to transition off the streets. And they were welcomed into a rhythm of prayer, a community of prayer. And while Butler worked with these women in Liverpool, Parliament passed an act. A series of acts, actually. The Contagious Diseases legislation. And the Contagious Diseases Acts were a set of 3 sanitary laws passed during the course of the 1860s to protect the armed forces from the threat of what was an epidemic of venereal disease. The acts authorized plainclothes policemen to apprehend and detain any woman in a port or garrison town suspected of prostitution. Mere suspicion. No actual evidence was necessary effectively suspending habeas corpus, and the legislation required detained women to undergo a painful medical examination to ascertain whether or not they were infected with syphilis or gonorrhea. If they were found to be carrying the disease, they were confined to a special lock hospital for periods which extended through the Act up to 9 months. If at the end of that period they were disease-free, they were given a certificate to prove that they were clean, and then they were released to resume their work of selling sex on the streets. Now, effectively, government-certified prostitutes. State-sanctioned vice, Butler called it. But the point is that under the terms of the Act, there was no equivalent examination required of male clientele. Men could carry on their business, reputations intact, and no questions asked. One standard of morality for women, another standard of morality for men. In an age of empire, the health of the military was a political concern, major priority. Parliament saw these just as perfunctory sanitary acts about hygiene. But Butler saw the acts through the faces of her friends in Liverpool. And for her, they were a concrete example of this invidious, invisible inequality. They provided the opportunity, she describes it as an opportunity, to laser focus on something tangible that expressed, as it were, the tip of the iceberg that ran through the heart of Victorian society. And in 1869, a national association was formed to oppose the bill. Alongside it, a very small ladies' national association for the same purpose. They had to have a separate ladies' one because they couldn't talk about sex in the same way as men, and it might be too distasteful. 14 women at the start, all of them unpaid volunteers. And it was this group that Butler was asked to lead. And it's worth just dwelling here for 1 minute, although I am a bit worried about the time. Is it okay? Yeah. We're in the story. Yeah. Okay, it's good. I get carried away with the story. But 14 women dwell there because this is another pivotal moment in Butler's life. It's a moment when she chooses to step off the beaten track. It's the moment when you're doing good work and everybody knows you're doing good work and they keep telling you you're doing good work. And then you take another step and people are not so forthcoming. This is the beaten track moment. She's president of the North of England Council for the Promotion of Higher Education for Girls when she's asked to lead the Contagious Diseases campaign. And this position put her at the centre of a respectable middle-class women's reform movement, the kind of reform movement that you hold in the nice drawing rooms of friendly kindred spirits. This is Butler at this season of her life. She just edited a prestigious work called Women's Work, Women's Culture. She was at the height of her career. When she said yes to leading the campaign to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts, there was an outcry from the women's reform movement. What a waste of talent. Why give your energy to a cause that's not only futile, self-evidently futile, it's also morally dubious. Why work for women who've wasted their lives when you could work to expand the opportunities of women who have not? It was perfectly acceptable to reclaim individual sinners, but to challenge the issue of systemic prostitution, a systemic problem that was dealt with by turning a blind eye to men's so-called natural proclivities, that was a different thing altogether. That was not what was being discussed. The principle itself was unaddressed. But for Butler, if these laws were left unchecked, then no other reform would be possible for women. You can do all the educational reform you like, but unless you've dealt with the stinking sewers, that beautiful house over the top will never be fit for purpose. She made a crucial set of connections, a set of connections which really lies at the core of what we might want to call her feminism. The way a society treats its most vulnerable members is a reflection of the true nature of that society. Butler connects the pain of the few to the injustice of the many. As she argued in a very important essay published in 1871 on the Constitution violated, the danger of the whole community is imminent when the safeguards of law and constitutional right are swept away from any portion of the community. Or, to put it in the language of Matthew's Gospel, as indeed Butler did, whatever you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. And with her imagination seeped in the biblical text, she sees the acts through the person of Christ, through the gospel stories that describe Jesus' encounters with women. The woman caught in adultery, the woman at the well, the woman who anointed Jesus with oil from that alabaster jar at the house of Simon the Pharisee. These are the stories that script her imagination. And every encounter, Butler argues, that we see Jesus having with women involves an act of liberation. Crucially, Jesus not only welcomed the outcast, he became the outcast, submitting to the shame and exclusion in order to upend every category of power, every definition of human power. She put it, God himself must bow to meet the evil, must shoulder its deadly weight, grasp it in its breadth, its length, its infirmity, and thus and only thus conquer it. So in 1869, Butler resigns her position as president of this council, and she gave a really important resignation speech that reveals her mysticism. There's a word. We can come back to that if we want to talk about it later. I think she stands in the Christian mystical tradition. And this little resignation speech gives us a sense of her calling, a sense of vocation. It appears to me as if God in his goodness has said to me, I approve your motive and your work. That is the work to reform education and expand the opportunities for women. But you're trying to lay on the top stone while there is an earthquake shaking your foundations. You must descend to the lowest depth before you can safely build up. And for Butler, the pathway to social and political transformation lay in prayerful solidarity with women right on the margins, outside the power. And she takes the opposite tack. It was a very bold and decisive step in her life. And it's Butler's ability to reimagine the woman who had been prostituted, not as chattel, not as common prostitute, as the terms of the Acts described these women, but as human beings with equal rights before the law. And it was this ability to reimagine that actually made her work so radical and of such lasting significance. She refused to use the cultural categories. She changed the language. Fallen women, for example, was one category that she deeply disliked. The minute you talk about fallen women, you're also talking about unfallen women, aren't you? You have one group of women alienated, and you have another group of women equally problematic who feel vindicated in their self-righteousness. She uses instead the word outcast women. And this is a very powerful retooling of the cultural language. It's a prophetic renaming because, of course, it shines the light on those who are doing the casting out. On the 1st of January 1870, the Ladies' National Association issues a sharp, well-worded 8-point manifesto denouncing the acts as a blatant injustice. Butler throws down the gauntlet, and the effect? Silence. Silence in Parliament, silence in the press, silence from society. Because what actually seemed self-evidently right to her didn't, to those who were in one way or another benefiting from the existing system. It took 16 years before the acts were removed from the statute book. During those years, Butler stood up on platforms in most of the major cities in the British Isles, calling on communities to oppose the acts, speaking up for the rights of the marginalised. At the time, few women spoke in public. Fewer women still spoke about politics in public. And almost none spoke about politics and sex in public. This is Butler in this season of her life. She was pelted with excrement. She was physically assaulted, as were her husband and her 3 sons. She was the victim of arson attacks. She received repeated death threats. At one time, it took nearly 14 bodyguards to protect her from violent mobbing as she left a train to address a meeting in a town hall. The entire Butler family were, at the beginning, shunned by respectable society. But when Butler looked back on those 16 years, writing in 1894, living at that time in one room of her son's house where she spent her days in prayer, she thanked God that it took so long. This is her in that season. Because in the gap between prayer offered and prayer answered, that was when she learnt to persevere in prayer. If reform had come straight away, she wrote, it would have been simply that, reform. Superficial modification of behaviour. That's never going to really last. What was needed in the gap of persevering prayer, deep cultural transformation from the foundations up. And during that 16-year period, Butler formed communities of practice, communities of men and women from across the political, social, denominational spectrum, communities who prayed together, who worked together. As they prayed, they worked among marginalized women, among children, gathering evidence, hearing testimonies, collecting statistics, visiting families, the length and breadth of the country. And after 1874, across most of Europe, introducing local educational employment reforms, giving legal aid, encouraging women to resist the legal requirements of the Acts, forming links in Parliament. Butler gave evidence to sanitary commissions, to parliamentary commissions. She brought the testimonies of women and children to the attention of the powerful, literally stuffing them into her pockets so that she could put them on the table when the sanitary commissioners asked her questions. She mobilized a mass movement of prayer. Slowly, persistently, deliberately, they raised public and parliamentary awareness of the plight of destitute women and children caught in the underworld of prostitution. The crucial thing is, these communities included women who were on the streets, as well as women who'd come off the streets. They practiced in the present what they were praying for in the future. And these networks gave women confidence to act together as a group. You see them in the gallery, in the Houses of Parliament. They fostered a new form of female activism, because praying together reframed the meaning of political participation. Suddenly, challenging the status quo becomes doable as meeting with a group of friends from different communities in order to pray together. This was protest politics. And in Butler's work, prayer becomes this act of resistance to the cultural categories. It becomes, and I've used this phrase, the prophetic pedagogy of justice. It generates this alternative vision, but at the same time, it also realizes that vision in practice. And this is really, really important, because so many leaders are good at pulling things down. But actually, not so many are good at creating and building up. And as postmoderns, we are experts at critique, aren't we? We're so good. That's the basic theoretical mode, critique. But we have a crisis of generative, constructive imagination. And it's this crisis, I think, that's making creative, visional leadership harder and harder for us. And what you see in Butler is the ability to challenge the dominant paradigms and nurture the possibility of something new at the same time. That's Brueggemann-esque prophetic imagination language going on, and it fits Butler to a T. Historians point to these communities of practice as the backbone of the women's movement. And it's widely recognized that they were the molding sites that changed the elite reform movement, took it out of those nice drawing rooms, right onto the streets, into a mass movement from the grounds up. By the time Parliament passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act in 1885 that raised the age of consent to 16, where it still stands in British law today, and established the first legal protections for women and children against sexual violence. By the time they wiped the Contagious Diseases Acts off the statutes books in 1886, 14 women become a mass movement, an unstoppable tide, as it was called. And Butler's approach lays the groundwork for the suffragists, but also for the suffragettes, with their emphasis on direct action. What's interesting to me, historians know how important it is. I won't talk for much longer, I promise. Okay. They leave out the prayer bits. The historians talk about the importance of these communities, leave out. At the end of Butler's life, she was asked if the women's movement was a Christian movement. My own answer must be yes, it was. But not in the sense which is understood or misunderstood by some who think that a great number of clergymen and women and clergymen sprang up in England in the name of religion to lead this movement. It may seem a paradox, but it must be stated truly to my inner circle of friends that this movement was born of God, secretly inaugurated by years of silent prayer offered in the name of Jesus. When you read the source material, it's blindingly clear that Butler understood prayer as her chief work. Her thoughts on prayer are scattered across 90 different pieces of writing. And what I tried to do in the biography was to draw those fragments, those pieces of writing about prayer, to weave them into the story of her life, to try to reconstruct her perception, her practice of prayer, as it emerged in her experiences. Because I think prayer really was the core of who she was. There's so much more to say about that. But the great thing is, I have written about it. So you can read what she says about prayer. But please, can I just read one more bit from her and end with her language? She never got to see women given equal constitutional rights as men, even though she spent the last years of her life praying, interceding for that to happen. She prayed that a holy revolution might come upon the earth. And the prayer I now offer in my secret chamber is that the veil may be taken away and the selfishness may be removed from the hearts of men who deny women equality and keep them outside the Constitution. She didn't see the answer, but she saw the answer coming. I pleaded his promises. Then a great hush came over my soul, a kind of awe in the divine presence. I was overpowered. I held out my hand and said, "Take this weak hand into thy powerful hand." And I realized that he did. He took my hand in his, and he promised me he would hold it forever, and that my prayer was safe with him forever. I do believe that God remembers our prayers long after we've been forgotten. Stop there.
Sarah, thank you so much. It was a great evening of listening to you tell the story of Josephine Butler. What a pleasure. I'm going to try very hard not to be selfish and take up the entire 30 minutes to just have a chat with you.
I'm sorry that I talked for so long.
No. You were perfect. You were perfect. But I will, perhaps, as you gather your thoughts to ask some questions yourselves, take a moment to ask a few questions of you. Yeah. What inspired you to write a new biography of Josephine Butler? And how do you see your approach differing from previous biographies of her? I mean, I want to say it's about prayer, but I also want to let you speak to that.
Well, I mean, it really is about prayer.
Yeah.
So what's so striking is there are many biographies of Josephine Butler, many very good ones. Mm-hmm. But what's incredible is that none of them really talk about prayer. And as I read the material, I just couldn't believe that. Yeah. And it was the relationship between her political theory, her understanding of what constitutes the political life, and her prayer-filled imagination that's so gripping. So you can't really talk about Butler's feminist theory or her political philosophy without understanding the nature of prayer. And that's really what drew me in. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. If I can talk about sources for a moment.
Yes.
One historian to another, yes. Your book draws extensively on Butler's own writings, her letters and such. You've obviously spent a lot of time in the archive. In that time, what was perhaps the most surprising or illuminating discovery you made during your research?
I love that question. Well, it was actually George.
Tell us more about George.
She's really difficult on the source material. Very quickly, she burnt most of it because she didn't want to be a saint. She didn't want adulation. She called it, she uses very strong language to describe how repugnant she finds the idea of people looking at her life. Talks about doors pecking at an eye to see into somebody's life. She didn't want that. So she burnt a lot of the material, which is tragic. So we actually rely a great deal on her published writings. And what I had to do in talking about prayer is I had to look at the way in which she teaches prayer in the published material. I had to use that to reconstruct and corroborate from the material. When you do that, you realize that when she writes about George, she's writing a life of prayer along the lines of the great ancient lives of the saints. It has the same rhythms of the life of prayer as she describes her husband's life. So she writes his biography. She writes a biography of her father, not untypical for women in the Victorian period. But in those, of course, we see her own self-portrait, but we see these portraits of prayer. And so what was so striking for me was the way that we don't see George in the biographies. And yet for Butler, he is her exemplar of prayer. And it comes through so palpably and so powerfully, the way in which their prayer life as a couple, they play off one another, and their unity is deeply rooted in prayer. So George was the big surprise. And I think that somebody needs to write a biography about him. It won't be me, but somebody should do it.
Yeah. Excellent. I do think that George needs some attention in this because a lot of men would not have supported a wife who was doing something as out there as Josephine Butler was.
No. One of my sad moments was I got to look at this archive I was telling you about supper, of Friends in Council, which is this group of George's friends in Cheltenham. 12 men who met together to talk about interesting things like Shakespeare and stuff. And when you look at the sources, I mean, they're in a box in a chap who's the secretary and he happened to live in my village. But anyway, I'm going through this stuff. Everybody's described by their professions. So you've got Dr. Claude Kerr. You've got all these people described by their professions. And then you get to George Butler, and it just says, the husband of Josephine Butler. Nothing else. And it just makes your heart ache for this man who's invisible in many ways.
But how many times have women been the wife of?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, that's true. That is very true.
Bless George.
Yeah.
Do be going to the microphones yourself if you do have a question, but since you're not there yet, I'll just keep asking my own questions. You invited it in using the word mysticism. Can you tell us more about Butler's mysticism, including perhaps her attraction to Catherine of Siena in medieval Italy?
Yeah. Yeah, the book started as a literary analysis of Butler's biography written in 1878 of 14th century Christian mystic Catherine of Siena. And Butler writes an extended biography, which is, again, is a work about prayer. It's her most extended understanding of prayer. And in that book, Butler's own mystical life becomes clear. She describes Catherine's mystic circle, but at the same time, she's reflecting on her own group of friends, women that she prays with. She stands in the Christian mystical tradition, not only in her spiritual practices, but at multiple levels. So, for example, prayer is the gateway to self-knowledge. Union with God is the ultimate goal of all of life and the chief delight of all of life. That emphasis on deep, profound intimacy and experience of union with God. That's the language that seeps into her imagination.
Yeah.
Oh, this is a blast from the past.
Carrie, hi.
Carrie at a microphone fills me with dread still.
Sarah, I'm so glad to hear you speak there about Catherine of Siena, and I'm 2/3 of the way through the book, and I love the way that you depict her telling of Catherine of Siena as a kind of apologia for her own vocation and her own kind of purpose in the world. And I read so much in Josephine Butler, her commentary on the life in Oxford, you know, the loss of a child, her love of George Butler and his creativity and innovation in education. I read of her commentary on the patriarchal influences on theological discourse. And I wonder, I'm curious how much her telling of Catherine's story, there's a parallel for you in the telling of her story.
Totally. In that, there's a very specific connection. So I tried to use the same pedagogical and methodological approach that Butler adopted in the way she wrote about Catherine of Siena, in the way that I sought to write about Butler. And you know that of me, Kerry, that content is never alone. Form and content are part and parcel of an overall message. And therefore, to write about Butler, I actually had to apply her methodology, her entering in to the story of a woman of prayer, to do justice to Butler's story. And so I used her reflection on Catherine of Siena really as the basis for the way that I wrote about it. And it made me uncomfortable because it kicked the analytical historian. I realized, just as she did when she wrote about Catherine of Siena, that the only way to understand prayer is to learn how to pray. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I was really curious when you mentioned that Butler had an influence or an impact on the suffragette movement and direct action. And I was just wondering if you could say more about that. And I'm especially curious, did she ever interact with the WSPU and Emmeline Pankhurst? Did she have thoughts on the direction of that movement?
Yeah, most certainly. The very specific connection is that Butler actively encouraged women to resist the terms of the Contagious Diseases Acts. And as they set up those communities of practice, they were supporting women in breaking the law. Right? So you can see how the suffragette stream pulls that forward. For Christabel Pankhurst, Josephine Butler is an absolute, I mean, Christabel is complex, but she's an absolute embodiment, a model, a kind of, in many ways, a venerated saint, even by the time you get to the Edwardian period. So those streams filter through. And what's unique about Butler, really unique, is that she brings the suffragist stream and the suffragette stream together. And they are literally going in opposite directions. But for both of them, Butler operates as a kind of inspirational source, right through to the end of the interwar period, which is extraordinary. Extraordinary. Yeah. Yeah. And she manages to somehow marry that up with extremely nuanced Christian theology of resistance. Very interesting. Yeah.
Lovely. There's another question here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very stimulating discussion, and you talked a lot about different standards for men and different standards for women. And I live in Italy, and the Romans said, "Mater sempre certe este, pater nunquam," meaning mother's always certain, father never. But with, I think now with embryo implants, maybe that's not valid anymore. However, with DNA, it is valid, because you can find out who the biological mother and father are. And now, in Italy, there is a law that the biological father has to pay. And it's even gone further that a lot of biological fathers want some access to the child as well. And I would just like to know have you comment on that, and if you know it's in any other places than Catholic Italy.
Well, Larisa Passerini, who's a historian of interwar Italy, actually writes about the movement to have paternity laws, bastardy laws, infant support laws, and how many of those are actually drawn through from British examples. There is research still to be done, and I would like to do this. This is why the George biography might have to sit on the shelf a little bit. To understand the international connections and the letters that Butler wrote at the end of her life to women involved in the women's movement all over, not only Europe, but in Australia, in the US, and in New Zealand. That work's not been done yet. Italy is very, very important, and Butler is extremely influential in the long arc of Italian history, because her sister, her dearest friend, Hattie, was married to an Italian banker. So she traveled to Italy on a regular basis and was involved in these communities of practice. And I can't prove the link, but I have a research hunch that if you follow that through, some of those laws that insist on paternal responsibility actually emerge from the crucible of this exact period as you transition into the early part of the 20th century. Yeah.
No, thank you. But are there modern laws like Canada? Is Canada up to date on things like that? Would they be able to establish the father and immediately hold him financially responsible or otherwise responsible? I mean, this is still a very new thing in Italy, but I'm just assuming with the scientific evidence, how do they pursue it legally? In I guess modern countries, which I mean, Canada's supposed to be part of the group of 7, so I guess they're semi-modern.
Yeah.
Not always, but that's my opinion.
I don't know how to answer the science point. Yeah, and I'm looking at Margaret here on the science. There are laws in Canada, but there are also laws in Britain which can enforce paternal contributions. I don't know about the science. And I'm also not sure where Josephine Butler would stand on the science. So she is really, really interesting on science, because there she is, involved in the contagious diseases legislation, which is a sanitary law, effectively using scientific data to determine illness. She's against that law, but she's also against vaccination of babies for smallpox. Now that's really intriguing.
It is.
Yeah. Really intriguing. Her argument there is that the state doesn't have, she doesn't use the word state, but government legislation doesn't have the authority to intervene in the body. That's really interesting. And when you think about that, in terms of the theology of it, but also in terms of the politics of it, she's going to take a very different tack from the bulk of the women's movement, who are going to begin to use state legislation to assert the rights and privileges of women from the 1880s onwards. Butler was very uncertain about that, very cautious about it as a trend, for theological reasons. So now, today, it would be interesting to know where she would stand on that. Very interesting to know. And you can try and extrapolate, but it's It's a complex argument. I think she might be quite uncomfortable with the use of science for those purposes. Yeah.
Don't be shy, but again, I will just keep asking questions if nobody's at the microphones. Sarah, you started your talk tonight by saying that Josephine Butler has been ignored too much because she was too Christian for the feminists and too feminist for the Christians. Has your work begun to draw that together? Do you have a sense of that yet?
Well, this is me being a real bashful Brit. What's been really interesting in terms of the reception of the book has been, I thought that I was writing a popular biography. I was trying to write a popular biography, and it's been very interesting to see the way in which it's been received. It has been received as a popular biography, but it's also been received as an academic piece. I thought I was writing a book for Christians. It's really interesting when I went to speak at the feminist societies in Durham University when somebody asked me if I was a person of faith, because they couldn't tell from the way I'd written the book. And I was like, that's a win, right? Because I want to draw people in to encountering faith as we journey with Butler in her language. So it's been really fascinating. And it's amazing how around a figure that people, for example, the feminists, I mean, the feminism is in such disarray at the moment. It is so deeply split between the radical feminist position and the gender critical position. Everybody is trying to define what they mean by feminism. But what's fascinating is a figure like Butler is just as she brought the suffragists and the suffragettes together in her day, she's also managing to bring these disparate voices together in a room to actually talk about the history of feminism. So I found myself able to talk about faith in some extraordinary places to groups of people who I thought would be profoundly hostile, and they can't get enough of it. People are really comfortable talking about prayer, talking about spiritual practices. I had a young woman in Oxford, this is just anecdotal, but a young woman in Oxford, can I tell this story really quickly? Can I tell this?
Yes, please.
She came to a book launch event I was doing in Oxford because she'd seen a poster and she'd recognised the name Josephine Butler. I know that name, she said when she came forward. She'd seen the name Josephine Butler in a set of diaries written by a European, in this case, German activist, female activist, in the early 1910s. And she found the name Josephine Butler because in the collection, there were letters sent from Josephine Butler to this German political activist. And they had exchanged. Anyhow, the girl's doctorate was on the Christian faith of this German activist that had come about through this relationship with this obscure woman, Josephine Butler. So she turns up at my book launch in Oxford, comes forward and said, I don't know anything. She had a German accent, I won't do it. I don't know anything about Christian faith, but would you meet and have coffee with me and talk to me about this? So I did. But I mean, it's just one example of this interesting and curious way in which this woman's faith has a life of its own, as kind of ongoing power, I think, which is to do with prayer. It really is to do with prayer. Yeah.
There's a question just here.
Jane, yeah.
How do you think Butler would critique, and maybe more interestingly, what would she embrace about the contemporary feminist movement?
She believed in the importance of the sexed body, absolutely, categorically. So the notion of undoing what constitutes woman, she would have really, really struggled with that. I mean, she would have had something very strong to say about that. That's number one. But there's number two as well. She would have had something to say about the twisting of the meaning of the sexual double standard in late 20th century and early 21st century feminism. Because the way that the term sexual double standard is used today by writers such as Anthony Giddens in his Transformation of Intimacy is the sexual liberation post-1960s has resulted in the end of the sexual double standard. How? Women can now behave sexually in the same way as men. In other words, you deal with the sexual double standard by lowering the standard for everybody. And there's true equality, which is something to be celebrated within a particular political paradigm. And yet what you've actually done is you've utterly kind of gone to the absolute other end of what Butler meant by the sexual double standard. Butler's solution to the sexual double standard? Male purity. Men living lives of honor towards women. That's how you deal with it. Today, women exercising the same license as men. And I think she'd have a great deal to say about that. I'm just trying to figure out what language she would use to say it in. Because she was brilliant, brilliant. Her genius was the ability to deploy language to change the conversation. And if she was here today, she would have the ability to do that, I think. And we really need that. We need something to open up to allow us to be able to talk. I mean, that's how I really got into Butler, was all the gender stuff. I've just been trying to learn a bit from her. Yeah. But those are two things. There's lots more, I think, but those are two things. Thank you, Jamie. Margaret's here.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is more of a commendation, maybe, than a question, but as you know, I work in palliative care as a physician.
Yes.
And that communion with those who are in anguish is something that really speaks to my heart. And I think that if people can grasp the beauty of being in those hard places and get rid of the lie that our society is telling us, that all kinds of suffering are the worst kind of evil, that we are nearest Jesus, like Mary said, I've seen Jesus, you've had me in your home, that we have a way of turning our world upside down as well. And maybe Josephine Butler is showing us the way, and thank you to you, Sarah, for making her accessible to us.
Great. She's good on dying, because she's ministering to Mary as she's dying. But that avalanche of women that I described were being called on in the night to go and pray with women who were dying on the streets. And she didn't do the conventional evangelizing. She just would speak the name of Jesus. Literally, I mean, we do that stuff in our little charismatic worlds, but she was doing it a great deal before all of that. Yeah.
Sarah, thank you so much for
you're
such a
so welcome.
stimulating evening.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Sarah again.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your questions as well. And thanks to the donors who've made this lecture possible. If you'd like to donate to future evenings like this, there's a box by the door. Thank you in advance. A reminder that the recording of tonight's event will be available soon and until August 31st on Regent's YouTube channel. Next week, if you'd like some more lectures, there's going to be another lecture on Monday by John Owen on what is wrong with democracy. And on Wednesday by Brittany Kim on Hagar, Leah, and the God Who Sees. We'd love to see you back at 7:30 on Monday and or Wednesday. Have a good evening.